I reside in Portland, Oregon, but due to the nature of my job, I often find myself in entirely different cities for weekends or even occasionally for a couple of weeks. My line of work is akin to that of an event manager, and naturally, it necessitates extensive travel across the country to be present at various events. My company covers the cost of my flights, but it seemed that regardless of my destination, I was always booked on the most budget-friendly flights available. I understand the company's desire to economize, but this often resulted in less than pleasant flight experiences. To say that I encountered some interesting individuals would be an understatement, but to be completely honest, I didn't mind much. I suppose I figured that as long as I arrived at my destination safely, that was the primary concern, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I found myself at the Dallas airport on a Sunday night, en route back home to Oregon after a weekend of relentless work, with another workday looming ahead on Monday. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and I had to practically drag myself to my gate. I should mention that my flight had 2 segments, with the first leg taking me from Dallas to Sacramento and then on to Portland. The initial flight wasn't too crowded. I occupied the window seat, with only one other passenger in my row, a middle-aged man who appeared fairly ordinary, albeit his somewhat worn and tattered attire. But then again, who dresses up for a flight, right? We engaged in polite small talk for a few minutes, though I was primarily inclined to rest my head against the window and fall asleep, given my extreme fatigue. I took out my phone to have something to watch, but before I could even close my eyes, I noticed the man glancing over his shoulder in my direction. I tried to dismiss it, thinking he was merely interested in the view outside rather than my movie. However, less than a minute later, I overheard him muttering something along the lines of, "Oh great, just ignore me then." This repeated several times, but I convinced myself that I might be misinterpreting his actions. Eventually, I observed him intensely scribbling in a leather-bound book he held. Instinctively, I kept glancing over at it, and it became apparent that the entire page was filled with minuscule handwritten text that I could barely decipher. While I strained to make out the words, I realized he was writing about me. My name was unmistakably on the page. I speculated that I must have mentioned my name during our earlier conversation, but I couldn't discern the rest of the text, due to its tiny size and distance, making it nearly impossible for me to fall asleep. I felt deeply disturbed, as anyone would in such a situation. Finally, we landed in Sacramento, and passengers began disembarking. However, the man seated next to me made no effort to gather his belongings. It reached a point where it was our row's turn to exit, but he remained seated with his head down, causing those behind us to start getting off the plane. I finally spoke up, explaining my tight connection and the need for him to move. Still with his head down, and in a nearly inaudible tone, he stated, "I'm going to follow you. You're not leaving this airport alive." I let out a nervous laugh, assuming he was joking, but his demeanor seemed alarmingly serious. He got up and allowed me to pass, but as we exited the plane, it became evident that he genuinely intended to follow me. My brisk walk turned into a jog, and glancing behind me, I realized he was doing the same. After about 5 minutes of this pursuit, I reached the gate for my connecting flight, with the man still closely behind me. I approached the gate desk, struggling to maintain my composure, and firmly explained that I had no knowledge of this man who was now standing beside me. Both the airline employees initially chuckled, thinking it was a joke, but upon seeing the desperation in my eyes, their smiles faded. Hesitantly, they requested to see our boarding passes, and I handed mine over. To my surprise, the man also provided his. The employees made a few calls and subsequently directed me to follow them. They promptly led me through the boarding gate and closed it before the man could enter. I was allowed to board the plane a full 10 minutes ahead of other passengers. Eventually, the rest of the passengers were allowed to board, and a woman seated behind me inquired about the situation. I provided her with a brief summary, and she disclosed that the man had a complete and extreme meltdown the moment I boarded the plane. He was shouting and seemed to be on the verge of a breakdown. The police were ultimately summoned to remove him from the aircraft. This revelation left me absolutely horrified and led me to believe that the man had genuinely intended to harm me. It was evident that he was grappling with severe mental issues, although I cannot confirm this as I have not received any further information regarding the incident. If that is indeed the case, I can only hope that he receives the necessary help and support. This incident occurred approximately a decade ago, when I was around 7 years old. My family has always been enthusiastic travelers, and as a result, even at such a young age, I had accumulated numerous airplane trips under my belt. I was also quite familiar with our local airport and its layout due to our frequent travels. On this particular occasion, we arrived at the airport gate about 2 hours before our flight. I distinctly recall waiting for roughly half that time when nature called, prompting me to inform my parents of my need to use the restroom. Knowing that I was well acquainted with the airport's layout, they allowed me to go on my own. I embarked on the 5-minute walk to the main bathrooms, which happened to be the only ones I knew of. It was around 3 a.m., and it seemed like this was the time when the bathrooms underwent cleaning, as they were cordoned off, indicating they were closed. Being a 7-year-old with limited decision-making skills, I decided to wander aimlessly in search of another restroom. This led me to a hallway that seemed somewhat isolated from the rest of the airport. I thought I spotted a restroom sign at the end of the hallway, so I ventured down it. However, when I was about halfway down the hallway, I spotted a man peeking around a corner. I instinctively halted in my tracks, and he called out, "Hey, kid, come over here." Without giving it a second thought, I continued toward the man, assuming he was an airport employee who would direct me to another bathroom. However, that was not the case. The man explained that he was lost and needed my assistance in finding the correct gate for his flight. At the time, I not only trusted and believed him, but was genuinely excited at the prospect of helping an adult. As I mentioned earlier, I was familiar with a substantial portion of the airport, and the idea of assisting someone made me feel special. I agreed to help him, but wanted to inform my parents quickly before doing so, not out of caution, but because I was genuinely excited and wanted to share my helpful intentions with them. I told the man that I would be right back and began walking back towards my gate. However, the man began yelling at me, insisting that we didn't have enough time because his plane was about to depart. I assured him that I would be quick. After exiting the hallway, I glanced back and saw the man practically sprinting out of the hallway and down the stairs leading to the airport's exit. I found it strange, but didn't mention it to my parents. After eventually locating a usable restroom, I all but forgot about the incident. Fast forward to a couple of years ago, when some coworkers and I were reminiscing about peculiar childhood experiences. That memory suddenly resurfaced, and with the wisdom of age, it took only a moment to realize the potential danger I had narrowly avoided. In hindsight, I should have immediately informed my parents, but I hope that the individual didn't attempt such actions with any other vulnerable children like me. It was a deeply unsettling realization of the danger I had unknowingly faced that day. I'm currently a college student, and given that most of my finances are dedicated to my education, any extra income is greatly appreciated. Consequently, midway through the semester, I decided to take up a part-time position as a ramp agent at my local airport. Essentially, my role involves handling the loading and unloading of baggage from airplanes. On occasion, we are tasked with transporting deceased individuals in cargo containers, and one fateful night, it happened to be one of those instances. To add to the challenge, the weather was inclement, not just a light drizzle, but a torrential downpour accompanied by frequent lightning strikes. Naturally, my manager assigned me to work on this particular plane, and my responsibility was to remove cargo from the storage bin. Earlier that day, I had already been fatigued from my college commitments, but it was the last flight of the night, and all things considered, the cargo load wasn't too heavy. My colleague Dave positioned the ramp for the plane and elevated it so I could access the storage bin by walking up the conveyor belt. I squeezed into the cramped space, making sure to distance myself from a white cardboard box containing a deceased individual. I was alone up there, and my main objective was to finish quickly as I longed to return home and get some sleep. Unfortunately, the conveyor belt moved agonizingly slowly to allow the ground crew to scan each package thoroughly. About 5 minutes into my task, the lightning grew more frequent and shockingly close. I had my earbuds in, attempting to ignore it, but then a deafening crash reverberated through the storage bin. It was lightning, so close that I was sent sprawling to the ground instantly. Instinctively, I looked up, and that's when I witnessed an incredibly eerie sight. Towards the end of the storage bin, shrouded in darkness, I saw the cargo container's lid, which had previously contained the deceased individual, fly off. What was even more unsettling was that the deceased person seemed to have been forcefully shifted from a lying position to an upright one, with such intensity that the lid was flung off. In a state of sheer panic, I sprinted down the ramp, with my coworkers yelling at me that the plane had been struck by lightning. Once safely indoors, I caught my breath and recounted the spine-chilling encounter to my colleagues. Their faces drained of color, replaced by looks of utter horror. After approximately 5 minutes of discussion, and hearing the fear in my voice, my manager decided it would be best if I simply headed home. During my drive home, I remained in a state of shock, uncertain of what to make of the inexplicable event. My doubts were partially resolved when a coworker messaged me, explaining that upon revisiting the storage bin, the lid to the cargo container had indeed been dislodged, but the deceased individual hadn't sat up. I conducted some research to determine if a lightning strike could generate enough energy to briefly tense a deceased person's muscles, causing them to sit up. Regrettably, I found no conclusive results on the matter. To this day, I remain uncertain whether what I witnessed was a result of the lightning, fatigue-induced hallucination, or some other phenomenon entirely. Regardless, the following morning, I made the decision to resign from my position at the airport. The trauma I had endured far outweighed any financial gain, making it clear that the money was no longer worth the toll it had taken on me.